We are thrilled that you could join us for this event and hope that you will visit the Redbird Educator Series website often to see what's coming. Before I introduce our wonderful presenter, I'll run through some logistics. We are set up as a traditional webinar style. There will be a 40 to 45 minute presentation followed by a 10 to 15 minute Q&A. So as you have questions throughout the session, please post them using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. At several points during the presentation, Dr. Beucher will invite you to share a bit about yourselves. Please use the chat feature for that. Now let's get started. We are delighted to have with us today Dr. Becky Beucher. Dr. Beucher identifies as a cisgender female, queer, and white American of Irish and German ancestry. She is an assistant professor of secondary literacy education in the School of Teaching and Learning and the lead faculty liaison and curriculum developer for the National Center for Urban Education. Becky is also a certified yoga instructor, is a certified Okuden second degree Reiki, is trained in restorative practices and in leading restorative conferences, and is currently training to be a somatic experiencing licensed practitioner. Dr. Beucher's scholarship engages critical new materialist, embodied literacies, discourse analysis, and critically oriented gender, queer, and race theories to understand how middle and high school youth navigate race and gender when participating in classroom literacy activities. Her research projects include collaborating with practicing high school English teachers to design and investigate how youth participate in culturally responsive critical new media literacy curriculum related to youth-led social movements like the hashtag No Dapple Water Protection movement and Black Lives Matter. She teaches undergraduate and graduate level classes in multiliteracies and technology, literacy theory, and multicultural education. She intertwines movement, meditation, mindfulness, and energy work in her engaged anti-racist contemplative practices. Her most recent work involves exploring avenues for integrating contemplative practices in teacher education, and she works to inform pre-service and in-service teachers of the benefits of anti-racist contemplative practices for themselves and for their students. Becky?
Thank you, Deborah. All right, I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement statement. An estimated 18 million Native people were custodians of the North American continent when European colonists arrived. They and their ancestors had lived here for an estimated 14,000 years. And that's a quote from Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hands. I would like to begin today by recognizing and acknowledging that our campus sits on the lands that were once home to the Illini, Peoria, Miami, and later, due to colonial encroachment and displacement, to the Fox, Potawatomi, Sauk, Shawnee, Winnebago, Iowa, Mascoutin, Pikanashaw, Wea, and Kickapoo nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these native nations prior to their forced removal, and these lands continue to carry the stories of these nations, inclusive of their struggles for survival, their ongoing fights to have their culture, their language, and their ways of life, and their rights to their land respected and honored. Acknowledging the displacement and forced removal of Native people from their land is important, but so too is advocating for Native people's land rights and contributing to these efforts. I'm donating a portion of the proceeds that are coming from this talk to the Civil Liberties Defense Center, a legal defense fund who is working to defend the rights of the water protectors. This land acknowledgement statement is the product of a multi-year joint effort of professors from the Women's and Gender and Sexuality Studies program and the English, Theater, Dance, History, Sociology, and Anthropology departments at Illinois State University and is being used in units across campus. I encourage you and your school to adopt your own version of a land acknowledgement statement, and you can learn more at the website that's listed on this page. I'd like to thank Dr. Deborah McPhee and Molly Davis for inviting me to be a part of this Redbird Educator Series. We need people who are in positions of power to open the doors for these difficult conversations to happen if we are to effect meaningful and sustaining change. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, Dr. Courtney Hatton and Dr. Anik John, for your thoughtful feedback on this talk. And I'd like to thank Ruth King, Resma Menachem, and Ibram Kendi for their work in anti-racist that has informed this talk on anti-racist education and embodied contemplative practices, and it has informed my thinking and my teaching on this topic. Shortly, I'm going to introduce some vocabulary words that are important to this conversation, but I want to begin by naming what we're talking about. In this conversation about embodied contemplative practices, we're talking specifically about the human body and how the body responds to and holds racism. It's imperative that we acknowledge that, as Resma Menachem writes, race is a construct, but it has teeth and it bites, meaning how our bodies experience racism is very real. And people who live in racialized bodies, marked as non-white or Black, brown, and indigenous and people of color, experience racism in fundamentally and systematically different ways than people who live in white bodies. I'm speaking to the Black and the brown-bodied peoples on this webinar. There is trauma that can be felt when we talk about racism, and I want to acknowledge that. Yet we can't educate white-bodied people without talking about the things that evoke that pain. So while this webinar is not the venue for deep dialogue and getting to know one another, I hope that beyond this talk, you will be inspired in your own communities to have these deep dialogues. But in this space, I'd like to just invite you on the chat, for those of you who are on this webinar, to just share something about who you are. Let's welcome each other into this space. So anything that feels authentic to you, so that could be your name, anything else that feels authentic to share in this space. So I'm just going to pause and see. So just take a minute. Hi, Marge. Hi, Adrienne. Hi, Timothy. Hi, Joyce. Hi, Susie. Hi, Dorothy and Zachary and Amanda. Hi, Claudia and Jenna. Oh, wonderful. Well, let's just keep that going. Wonderful. I see some of my friends on here, family members, students, past and present. And I just want to recognize that we have educators all the way from kindergarten through college level education. We've got school administrators here. We've got folks from around the state of Illinois, and we also have folks joining us from all the way from California and from Denver, Colorado, and all the way up from Chicago down to Southern Illinois, school psychologists and special education teachers. So just an incredible collection of human beings in this space. So I welcome you all here and thank you so much for showing up to do this work. Some group norms and agreements for this conversation. I'm just going to bring us into this contemplative space with a mindful meditation. So I invite you to sit up tall in your chair. Place your feet on the ground. Allow your gaze to move away from the screen. And let's just take 3 collective deep breaths together. Inhaling deeply through the nose, sitting up tall. Exhale, releasing and softening. Inhaling once again through the nose, lengthening into the spine. Exhaling, relaxing the shoulders, the neck, and the hands. Inhale one more time. Exhale, release, soften the belly. Let's resource by feeling your feet supported by the ground. Feel your body supported in the seats. And I'd like to invite you to take a moment to think of someone in your life who brings you joy. Feel the warmth of the memory of this person. Feel the smile creeping up on in your face. And with this person in mind, repeat these words to yourself. May I be present May I experience grace. May I feel relief from pain and suffering. And may I feel joy. In keeping our community in mind, maybe you saw names running across the chats. Share this with others in this space. May you be present. May you experience grace. May you feel relief from pain and suffering. May you feel joy. And if you allowed your gaze to float away from the screen, I invite you back into this space together. So in this space, there are some times when I'm going to invite you to share, and sadly, we don't have a ton of time for that, but when we do share, I invite you to please exercise compassion and empathy, and also exercise compassion and empathy just as I go through the slides and we have this conversation. Take care of your personal needs, whatever that means for you. Please take care of yourself. Participate when invited and inspired. Be present. So if you can, turn off your email, turn off your other devices, allow yourself to be in this space for this hour together. Speak from your own position. So when sharing a story or sharing something that when I invite you to share, speak from your position only using I statements. And I just invite you to open up to listening to your body and sitting with your feelings and resourcing when appropriate, using some of the tools that we just used in the mindful meditation throughout this talk. We're going to move on to some vocabulary. Racism. A belief that race is determined by skin color and ancestry, by those in positions of power. It's a fundamental determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. Racist. One who is supporting racist policy and practice through their actions or inaction, expressing a racist idea. And that's from Ibram Kendi. Anti-racist. One who is supporting an anti-racist policy and practices, and I add what's in brackets. He focused specifically on policy, but this is an embodied practice talk, so practice is important to recognize here. So anti-racist, one who is supporting an anti-racist policy and practices through their actions and expressing an anti-racist idea. White body supremacy, the violent and dangerous myth embedded with racist policies and practices that purports that white bodies constitute the universal human norm. This term includes, quote, the pervasiveness, the magnitude, and normalcy of white dominance and assumed superiority, and that's from D'Angelo. And from Menachem, perpetuates the myth that white bodies are fragile and need to be protected. And Menachem specifically speaks about protection from Black bodies. BIPOC is a term that's growing in popularity that some people like, some people don't like, because that it then puts people back in categories and labels, and also creates division amongst racial groups. However, I think it's important in this conversation about racism and about bodies that are harmed by racism in systemically different ways. So BIPOC as Black and Indigenous and people of color, people who are othered, discriminated against, disenfranchised, and dehumanized historically and presently by racism and white body supremacy. And then our last definition, white. Those of European descent who have been able to identify with whiteness and who experience white body supremacy. So I want you to just sit with yourself for a moment, sit with these definitions, and just notice what you're feeling in your body as you see these words sitting on the screen. And I invite participants to share in the chat. If you're feeling something in your body, where are you feeling it? And maybe what are you feeling? You could also add a shape to the feeling or a color. Okay, so I don't see anything coming through in the chat, so I'm just gonna assume we're just sitting. We're just sitting in silent. Okay, here we go. I feel a pit in my stomach, yes. I feel that too, like something deep in our stomachs. Thank you. So others might be feeling that as well. That's oftentimes where we can feel some deep feelings. Thank you. Sadness and anger, abdomen, red, orange. Helplessness. And so then in helplessness, and so maybe that's connected with the stomach. Okay, thank you for sharing. The next definition I'm going to share is anti-racist contemplative practices. So this is a body of work and practices invested in healing bodies traumatized by white body supremacy through integrated somatic practices. And so some of which we've already begun with the breath work and noticing where our feelings are. There are connections to spirituality, to history, to culture. These contemplative practices recognize epigenetics and inherited ancestral traumas. And it also involves neuroscience and studying and understanding how the body works and how the brain works and how these things are connected or disconnected. And the goal is to promote holistic health and well-being for the human body in relationship to other human bodies and other animate beings and inanimate objects and matter. So that's where my kind of theory part comes in, with just thinking about the contemplative aspects of our interconnectedness with all beings in this universe. What I want to talk a little bit also about what anti-racist practices are not. So are and are not. Anti-racist contemplative practices are not about telling anybody to temper their anger. There's a lot to be angry about when we talk about racism, when we experience racism, when we witness racism. And I think that the term contemplative, or when we think about like yoga and meditation, that there's this idea that somebody in my position might be saying that I'm saying it's to temper your anger, and that's not what I'm advocating for at all. What I do believe that anti-racist or contemplative practices are supporting people in locating their center, aligning what your body is telling you with what your mind is saying and with what your mouth is saying. And so it's this holistic alignment throughout the body. This is also not about shaming white-bodied people. Guilt and shame paralyze white bodies into inaction. Trauma therapist Becky Carter argues that white bodies need to be mobilized into action, and I agree with her. Becky also argues that it's not the responsibility for Black and Indigenous and people of color to hold hope, but that it's a responsibility of white-bodied people to get together and agree to do something different. And so ultimately, anti-racist, contemplative, embodied practices are seeking to build embodied resilience through practices that regulate and balance the nervous system. So I want to talk a little bit about the connections between racism and trauma. And this is taken directly from Resmaa Menakem's work. And Resmaa is a therapist who's also trained in the somatic experiencing that I'm learning myself. And this psychotherapy work is really about locating and working with trauma in the body and moving it through the body. So trauma happens in the body. It's not an event. It's the way that the body survives an attack. Attacks can be immediate, they can be perceived, and they can be remembered. And through memory, then they can be perpetuated. Trauma stays in the body until the body moves and addresses the trauma. Trauma can be passed on generationally. And so that's where there's this connection to ancestry and intergenerational and inherited trauma that all bodies inherit by living in a world with racism. Trauma affects each body differently. And so while there are systematic and patterned ways that we can experience trauma based on the bodies that we live in, we also all have our own individual experiences. Racial trauma includes Black and Indigenous body and people of color bodied people it's important to recognize there's a large body of research around the the awful ways in which trauma, and racial trauma specifically, harms Black and Indigenous and people of color's bodies, making BIPOC people more susceptible to stress-related illnesses, diseases, and fatalities than white people. And resilience involves having a regulated nervous system. In the next slide, I'm going to share some examples of how Black and Indigenous and people of color identified student bodies are traumatized in school spaces through racist practices. And so you might be familiar with the occurrences or with these specific images, but I just want to give you a heads up that I'm going to share images that are going to probably make you feel something. And so in this, I want to recognize that witnesses also experience trauma that happens in the body when we witness racism, as well as when people experience racism. And so I want to just invite you to notice again what's happening in your body when we look at these images. And white-bodied colleagues and friends, if you aren't in the practice of noticing how your body feels when you witness racism, I want to invite you to attend how your body feels. And Black and Indigenous and people of color friends and colleagues, I encourage you to practice resourcing. So call up that person, that friend, or maybe you thought of an animal that brings you joy and warmth. And feel yourself supported by the chair that you're sitting in. Feel your feet firmly rooted against the ground. Maybe do some breathing. So practice resourcing while we're watching, while we're looking at these images. And I want to also invite everyone to just sit up tall and be present. Breathe through your nose or through your mouth and feel all the way down to your feet. So allow your breath to go all the way down to your feet, up and back out again. So we're all going to breathe. So let's just sit with these two pictures for a moment. So the first image is an image of Black students. So this is the title of the caption for this image. So Black students spit upon and pelted with garbage by parents after taking a knee at a high school football game. And then in the second image, insensitive and inappropriate, teachers dress up like the border wall, mimicking Mexican stereotypes for Halloween. So notice how you're feeling. And I invite sharing in the chat. So there was some sharing before with looking at the definitions and feelings of like feelings in this pit of the stomach. When I look at these images, like I can feel my fists clenching up. I feel anger like boiling in my belly. So there's a tendency, so what I'm trying to do is break you of, so I'm seeing there's some great adjectives coming through, but I want you to locate where what does this feel like in the body? So so teeth are clenched, feeling some numbness and some fatigue, tension in eyes, feeling heat, locate that heat, feeling a warmness in the neck, feeling tightness, where is the tightness? Feeling scared, where are you feeling the fear? Heart rate rising, nausea, jaw clenched, pit of the stomach. Okay, thank you. All right, let's move some of that energy through. So let's inhale through the nose, and then we're gonna exhale loudly. Inhale in through the nose, and now tighten, constrict the muscles in the throat when you exhale to this next time. Inhale one more time. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so we're sitting with the feelings, we're naming the feelings, we're locating the feelings. Because we have an integrated group, and I've directed some of you to sit with, some of you to resource immediately, but I also want to invite all of us to resource to learn how we can move these feelings through the body. And this isn't to say that this is going to, get rid of everything, because I imagine that there's some triggering that's happening. These are some feelings that we've had before that are coming back up. And so these somatic practices need to be done on a regular basis to keep moving these negative manifestations of emotion through the body. So let's talk a little bit more about what's happening in the body. And thank you so much for everybody for your participation in the chat, and also for your participation in the best way that you can by just being here and listening. All right, so welcome to the autonomic nervous system. So this is just a crude image of the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the longest nerve in the autonomic nervous system. It's an extremely important nerve in the body, which regulates many important bodily functions. And so you may have heard before of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. This language, or the parts of the autonomic nervous system, is becoming a little bit more mainstream. But it's important to recognize here. And as you're looking at this slide, I just want you to see, so if you notice that you were feeling something in particular in your body, notice if it was your parasympathetic or your sympathetic nervous system that were being activated and how you were responding to those images. So Resmaa Menakem says that when your body has an emotional response, such as when your pulse races, your shoulders tighten, you have a sense of danger lurking when you feel your heart opening and your spirit soars. So it's not just bad stuff that we feel with the regulation of the nervous system. It's also the good stuff too. Resmaa Menakem says that's your soul nerve at work. And so that's how Resmaa talks about this vagus nerve. So the sympathetic nervous system is the part that prepares the body for moving, for when you've got your fists clenched, your heart rate's going up. When the SNS becomes the dominant branch of the nervous system, blood is moved away from the internal organs into the muscles and the periphery of the body, so the arms and the legs, to facilitate action. So this is your fight. This increased utilization of nutrients and hormones produces a breakdown effect on the body. And so if you're in a constant state of stress, that's very wearing on the body. So the SNS is dominant when you're exercising, working out, or doing something that increases the delivery of blood to the muscles. And so that's why exercise is really important, because it gets your body used to having a raised heart rate or to activating your muscles, which helps to build internal resilience. And the parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for things like digestion, elimination of waste from the body. It serves to regulate restoration and rebuilding and repair of the body. And it also stimulates the immune function at night while you're sleeping. So this is why sleep is really important. This is why resting and breathing is really important, so that we can help the body settle down. So our body naturally oscillates between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system throughout the day. And so it's not just we're either parasympathetic activated or sympathetic activated. We're naturally, homeostasis means we're moving up and back through these. But trauma, racism disrupts that and manifests in trauma in the body, and then puts us out of whack. So I want to say I'm not a neuroscientist here, so biology teachers, please take it easy on me in the Q&A. But I think that what I just said is what's important for us to notice and to know as educators, is that the body has a very complicated and sophisticated way of keeping us alive. And so when we see people, or when we ourselves experience freezing, so shutting down, flight, also fighting, freezing, running away, or fawning, trying to appease, that's this complex system activating our survival. And so if we see students doing things that are deemed as inappropriate in school, it heeds us to pay attention to what's happening in the environment, or to even think about how many of our students are subjected to racial trauma on a daily basis that have put their nervous systems out of homeostasis. And so these responses that we're seeing, while they might not be what we want to see, which is alert, active, so-called motivated students, it gives us pause to think about what are the things that are happening that are causing our students' bodies to act in the way that they are, that are oftentimes outside of their control. They might not even be tuned into what's happening, but it's their body doing this very smart thing of protecting itself. And so just take a moment to think about when you feel under attack or when you feel shame, what do you do? Where is your go-to? Do you fight? Do you leave the situation? Do you avoid? Do you withdraw? Do you freeze up? Do you try to appease? And I think it's also important to notice how particularly our students of color get treated when they engage in these behaviors and the injustice around that, when their bodies are doing the best they can to protect them in impossible situations. So I've been talking a lot about Resmaa Menakan, and he's somebody who, so he wrote My Grandmother's Hands, which I drew on a lot in my own thinking about what I'm talking about in this talk. And he says that while we see anger and violence in the streets of our country, the real battlefield is inside our bodies. If we are to survive as a country, it is inside our bodies where this conflict will need to be resolved. And so when we think about racism, I want to call on us to think about racism, that racism keeps the body on a steady diet of trauma. And embodied contemplative practices can build resilience by supporting the body to move towards homeostasis. And if white people must be doing this work alongside Black and Indigenous and people of color. And if white-bodied people are not, then anti-racist practices, if white people are not doing this work, then it can almost feel futile for Black and Indigenous people of color to do this work, knowing that racism keeps the body on a steady diet of trauma. So the other aspect of contemplative practices that I'm talking about today is meditation. So why meditate? Why do these breathing exercises that ultimately are intended to calm the mind? And when I think about calming the mind on this beautiful fall day, I think about all the leaves falling down from the trees and all of those leaves being all the busyness of our minds, all that chatter, all those conversations that are happening. And that meditation helps to bring all of those leaves down to the earth so that we can sit on that surface without having all that chatter and all those leaves blowing around. And so I've got this great image, this picture of this human brain to represent the complexity of the brain. So human brains have approximately 100 billion neurons. So by comparison, cat brains have 100 million neurons. No offense to the cats, but there's a lot going on in human brains. And so much so that our brains become really inventive, and we develop all these stories around what we're experiencing in the world. And so when the body gets activated, our body reacts, our brain registers that, and then we create a story around that experience, which we actively remember. And that can be a part of what Resmaa was talking about with sometimes trauma is actual or sometimes it's perceived. And so that can be the perceived, that we have this perpetuation of memories of experiences. And so if we don't get to move that experience through our body, if we don't get to process it through our minds or settle and with a settled mind, then we might just hold on and perpetuate that experience and relive that trauma. And so in that way, our minds can work against our bodies when things are not aligned and in balance. And so meditation helps to build resilience in the mind. And this is where I really draw on Ruth King's work. And so Ruth King is the founder of the Mindful of Race Institute and also wrote Mindful of Race, which has a lot of great practices and exercises for mindfulness meditation. And Ruth says, the practice of a mindful meditation supports us in experiencing more mental ease and harmony. It does not help us to get rid of racial ignorance or ill will, nor will it erase anger or despair. Rather, it offers us a way to slow down and investigate our experiences with care and wise attention. Without wise awareness, habitual patterns rule our lives. Our mind wraps itself around our views, our perspective narrows, and we tend to feel dead right or just plain dead. With mindfulness practices, we will learn how to get still. We become interested in what's happening right now and the impact that it's having on us. In this potent pause, we can ask, is how I am thinking and feeling contributing to suffering or freedom? So some contemplative practices. Resourcing. So this is what we've done a couple of times throughout this talk. And there are a few different ways to do resourcing, but some of the ones that I've gone over today are to center on warm memories. Something else that you can do, or you can invite your students to do, is, especially with virtual learning, is to find an object in this space, in your space, that when you're feeling activated, locate that object and use it as a resource to call up those good, warm feelings. So you can do this with memories, you can do this with objects, you can do this with animals. You can also give yourself a hug. That's a great way to resource. You can give somebody who's washed their hands, who's in your shared space, a hug. You can hold your hands over your heart to give yourself a heart hug. Breath meditation. So I did some mindfulness meditation, so some guided meditation. You can also do, this is a simple breathing meditation that begins with just exhaling, clearing out the lungs, and then inhaling for a count of 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and then exhale 1, 2, 3, 4. Inhale 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale 1, 2, 3, 4. Movement is awesome. Dancing, we should all be dancing every day. I oftentimes have dance parties with my students in my classes. Exercising, which can just be as simple as like going for a walk, especially in this, beautiful fall weather. Other things that you can do that I didn't get to talk a lot about today, but that's also important, especially if you're feeling the feelings like sitting in your body and they feel a little locked in, are using sound. And this is something that Indigenous people have known for a long time. As well as musicians and singers. So you can make noises and you can think about moving the sound up and down your body. And so start with low sounds to get really down if you're feeling in your belly. So ooh, and then moving it up to ooh, all the way up into, if you're feeling constricted in your throat, ah. And that sound vibration can help to break up that negative, icky stuff that we're feeling in our body and up and down the channels of our body. And also chanting, if you're into yoga, I saw that we've got some yogis here, as well as singing. So belt it out, feel and be in your body. All right, so we're gonna move now into another exercise. And in this exercise, so I'm going to put my English teacher hat on. So we're going to look at a poem. And this poem is written by Audre Lorde, writer. So this is how Audre Lorde describes Audre Lorde. Writer, feminist, womanist, librarian, civil rights activist, self-described Black lesbian mother, warrior, poet. So Audre Lorde, the late Audre Lorde, was quite the provocative speaker and writer, and also wrote very much about, she knew and she understood the importance of considering the body. in her work and in her work for justice and racial justice and gender and sexual orientation justice. And so just to know a little bit about who she is. And so we're going to read this poem, and I intentionally chose this poem because Audre Lorde is such a powerful champion for justice, and also because her words are quite provocative. And I believe they're going to make all of us feel something in listening to these words. And so I want to invite us all to make note of what you're feeling in your body and where. So we're going to do this contemplative practice again. And Black and Indigenous and people of color colleagues and friends on this call, I invite you to practice resourcing and breathing. White body people, I invite you to sit with and examine your discomfort. So I'm going to just take a moment to share a different screen. I'm going to put Lorde's poem on the screen, and I'm also going to share a recording of Lorde reading this poem.
The first poems I'm going to read are from Between Ourselves, published by Eidolon Editions in 1976. And the first poem is entitled Power. This is a poem written out of the experience of the death of a 10-year-old black boy named Clifford Glover, who was shot down on the streets of Queens by a policeman about 3 years ago. This policeman was tried for his murder and acquitted. Power. The difference between poetry and rhetoric is being ready to kill yourself instead of your children. I am trapped on a desert of raw gunshot wounds, and a dead child dragging his shattered black face off the edge of my sleep. Blood from his punctured cheeks and shoulders is the only liquid for miles, and my stomach churns at the imagined taste, while my mouth splits into dry lips, without loyalty or reason, thirsting for the wetness of his blood as it sinks into the whiteness of this desert where I am lost, without imagery or magic, trying to make power out of hatred and destruction, trying to heal my dying son with kisses, only the sun will bleach his bones quicker. A policeman who shot down a 10-year-old in Queens stood over the boy with his cop shoes in childish blood, and a voice said, "Die, you little motherfucker, and there are tapes to prove it." In his trial, this policeman said in his own defense, "I didn't notice the size or nothing else, only the color, and there are tapes to prove that, too." Today, that 37-year-old white man with 13 years of police forcing was set free by 11 white men who said they were satisfied justice had been done, and one black woman who said, "They convinced me," meaning they had dragged her 4-foot 10-inch black woman's frame over the hot coals of 4 centuries of white male approval until she let go the first real power she ever had and lined her own womb with cement to make a graveyard for our children. I have not been able to touch the destruction within me. But unless I learn to use the difference between poetry and rhetoric, my power too will run corrupt as poisonous mold, or lie limp and useless as an unconnected wire, and one day I will take my teenaged plug and connect it to the nearest socket, raping an 85-year-old white woman who is somebody's mother, and as I beat her senseless and set a torch to her bed, a Greek chorus will be singing in 3/4 time. Poor thing, she never hurt a soul. What beasts they are.
So I want to just invite you now to take a moment and log your feelings. Another important part of contemplative practices is journaling. Journaling helps us remember. It helps us process. So just take a moment to write what you're feeling. If you feel called to resource, if you feel called to do some breathing, do what you need to do to take care of yourself. And then when you're ready to share anything that you've written in the chat, I invite you to share in the chat. So just an invitation to resist analyzing the poem, but sharing how you felt through the poem. And maybe naming where you're feeling in your body. Perhaps giving these feelings colors, shapes, sizes. And I'm just going to start to share what I'm seeing come through the chat. Wanting to scream, so maybe feeling it in your throat, Rebecca, lump in my throat, Amanda, frown on my face, stomach dropped, horrified, feeling heavy in the chest, feeling heartbroken, feeling sadness on the face, feeling exhausted, hand shaking, tears, all these ways in which our bodies are telling us something. So thank you everybody for sharing. So I want to just do one final thing here before I move into final thoughts and we have some time for a conversation. So just take your hands in front of you if this is something that you can do right now, wherever you are, and just rub your hands together. And breathe. So breathe through the nose or the mouth. Place the feet on the floor if you're sitting in a chair and if that's within your body's capacity today. Sitting up tall, continuing to breathe. And then take your hands and fold one on top of the other and draw them into your heart center. Drop your shoulders from your ears, sit up tall. And you can either lazily gaze through your eyelids off screen, or if it feels safe and comfortable, allow your eyes to close for a moment. And let's return to our opening mindfulness meditation. But I'm going to add some more thoughts to this. May I feel release from pain and suffering. May I feel open and courageous in my heart. May I feel connected to others in my community. May I feel ready to the work that must be done to address and dismantle systemic racism. And to our community, may you feel grace and love and kindness. May you feel connection. May you feel strength to do the work that must be done to dismantle systemic racism, knowing that that looks different for each and every one of us who are called into action and also called into self-care to take care of ourselves as we do this work. Release your hands, allow them to fall into your laps. So some final thoughts. Anti-racist contemplative practices takes practice. And so this is a conversation, perhaps a conversation amongst many that you're involved in. Perhaps this is the start of a conversation for you. So ultimately, contemplative practices and anti-racist work must be a daily, ongoing, sustained practice. I encourage you to develop some kind of a daily meditation practice that includes journaling. Feel free to reach out to me for resources, and we'll also be putting resources up on the website, on the Redbird Series website. When you feel activated, that's when your body needs you the most. And so I saw a lot of people talking on the chat about feeling hopeless, about feeling tired of talking about this, about feeling fatigue. And those are messages to pay attention to for your body. And going out and protesting and putting your body on the line, probably this is not the time for that for you, for what you need. Going for walks, exercising, meditating, eating nutritious food, getting your sleep. That's what your body is calling on you. So self-care, also dancing, playing, stimulating your mind, connecting with others, being empathetic in our practices. Recognize and name your emotions, and to make the time to process with racial affinity groups or on your own. Keep showing up for yourself and for your colleagues and for your students. And finally, harness your righteous anger. Center your response, center yourself, harness your voice. We as humans have a tendency to get stuck in the forms that we create because it is in our nature to do so. It is in our nature because we're made of energy that has the potential to become liquid or solid or gas. We become moon sun dancers, long dancers, or drum dancers to break the crystallization to unstick ourselves. And so I just leave us with these words from Joseph Rael, an indigenous mystic of the Southern Ute and Pickerus tribes and the land of the water plant. So thank you. So I think we're going to move into questions now and conversation.
Yes, we have. Thank you, Becky. That was lovely. There are a couple of questions in here. I think one came across in the chat, but I actually think you answered it. Is the Menachem reference to my grandmother's hands? And I believe you did say that it was. There are a couple of questions in chat, so let's move over there. And these are questions from teachers who are really interested in bringing these ideas into their curriculum. So one of the questions from Zachary is, how would you suggest introducing today's indictment of the officer who killed Breonna Taylor to second graders?
That's a great question. And to be honest, I'll say that the most of the work that I do is in secondary. And so those are the human beings that I spend most of my time with. But I also think, and I know that these conversations are conversations that young people need to be having. And so I think that I would ask students what they know, what they know about Black Lives Matter, to get a sense of where they're coming from, and where they're situated in these conversations. And I would also teach them to resource. You can do yoga at any level, but definitely bringing in games and play, I think, is an essential part of that. And I think that also bringing in literature that addresses these topics, so like Jacqueline Woodson's work, to be able to have this conversation with content that I think is going to be appropriate for your second graders.
Thank you. Caleb asks, he's interested in developing curricula that are not solely centered on Eurocentric cultures. Would you be a good person to contact at ISU to work with this?
Yeah, definitely. And also I can direct you to many of our colleagues who do work in that area. But yes, you can use me as an anchor point, certainly. And I can share resources that I have as well as direct you to other great colleagues that I have in the College of Education.
Just quickly, there's a question in the chat. Could you please show the slide of tools again? So we might just move back to that slide while we continue to talk for a few minutes.
Is that this slide?
Kristen, is that the
Kristen,
slide?
is that the slide you were looking for?
Right before the drum.
Oh, the final thought slide.
All right, Justin asks, I noticed you use language BIPOC-bodied and white-bodied. Can you explain how you came across this rhetoric and why you use it?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is coming, so Becky Carter is somebody also referenced at the beginning of the talk, as well as Resma Menachem talks about bodies. So this is people who work in it's somatic experiencing is the field of practitioner study. And this is psychotherapists are really doing this work, so mental health practitioners. And it's thinking about mental health from this embodied perspective rather than the talk therapy perspective. And so the focus then becomes on the body. And within a conversation about race, it's important that we name race because of the ways in which racism manifests in the body. And so that's why I'm specifically using the language of that refers to race as an identifier for bodies. Thanks for your question.
Okay, so here's another question from Marge. Our school goal is partially to review how diverse our class libraries are. So what are some must-have pieces that you recommend for the early grades, kindergarten through third?
Oh gosh. I'm sorry. I will have to get back to you on that question. I think that's a fantastic question, but that's and I can definitely send you some resources and make sure that there's some resources up on the website. But I want to speak from a educated place, and that's an area that is kind of outside of my area of expertise as a secondary educator. But I will definitely pull in some specific resources for you.
And actually, I can add that the Borg Center is working on some book lists for an upcoming project that we'll be sharing too. So that might help Marge too. So any suggestions for explaining the importance of being anti-racist to students in a predominantly white rural area?
Well, I think that from a somatic perspective, and this is, so I'll kind of break it down from the maybe more abstract place, but racial trauma affects all bodies, regardless of how you identify. And so I think that when you're talking with your students, having conversations with them about their feelings around racism can be an important place to start. And I don't know, maybe some people like to feel uncomfortable or angry about things, but I think most of us want to exist in our homeostasis and exist in our balanced selves. And until we do the work to interrogate our own racism, we will continue to live and sit with that discomfort. And so I think that having a conversation with students about, like, what are your feelings around what's happening? And why do you think you're feeling that way? And let's talk about that. And I think also going back to Ruth King's question about, are my actions aligned with perpetuating struggle or perpetuating people's freedoms? And so there's also that connection that we make as teachers to people beyond ourselves, beyond our immediate community, that I think is important for students to understand and to know why we do that.
We are at 5 o'clock. Can we squeeze in one more question and then we will close out? Abigail says she would love to have these kinds of discussions in her classes. Do you have suggestions for how to incorporate these conversations in an earth science class?
Gosh, Abigail, I mean, I'd say like I would like to know more about the conversations that you're already having to be able to support you in developing those conversations. But one thing that I think about with earth science is if you're talking about, I mean, if you're talking about land and land ownership and stolen lands, like that can be a part of the conversation. So that's one place where my head goes. But I think I would want to talk to you more about your content and think together with you to be more detailed in answering that question.
Thank you, Dr. Beucher. And thank you for participants for joining us today. We know that your time is valuable and we are honored that you chose to spend this hour with us. Within a week, you will find the recording of this webinar and the list of resources that Dr. Beucher has shared on the Redbird Educator website. We have 2 additional sessions this fall. On Thursday, October 8th at 4 p.m., we will feature Dr. Tara Kazarowski from the Department of Special Education for a webinar titled Inclusive Mathematics, E-Learning Methods and Routines that Promote Mathematical Thinking. And on Tuesday, October 27th at 4 p.m., you can join us for Rethinking the Role of Knowledge in the Literacy Classroom, featuring Dr. Courtney Hatton from the School of Teaching and Learning. Finally, we are interested in your feedback about this session and your ideas about topics for future sessions. Tomorrow, you will receive a follow-up email that will include a link to a short survey. If you're interested in receiving a PD hour for your attendance today, you will find the link to the evidence of completion form at the end of the survey. Again, thank you for spending some time with us today. Take care, and we hope to see you again soon.